Structuring, structuring AI in our learning, what we are missing in the conversation. I'm Heather Kretschmer, and together with Christina, we are your hosts. If you need anything during the session, please feel free to message us at any time. We are recording the session, so if you would like to, you can change your name. If you need help doing so, you can contact Christina or I. And now I'm going to share the hosting slides. One moment. All right, so here are the first couple of points from our community agreements. You are welcome here, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability or disability. All are welcome in this space. Please make space for others. Critique ideas, not people. And please always assume positive intentions of others in the room. Of course, participate to the extent that makes you comfortable. You can have your cameras on, cameras off, as you please. And please aim to be accessible. Describe any visuals that come up. All right. We'll be putting the community agreements in the chat. And I think at this time, we're ready to hand over to Lance and Rhoan.
Thank you, folks. I am going to do the good old sharing of the screen. And I believe I shared the right screen. I always mess that up, or most often mess that up. I should be a professional. And gonna hand it over to my friend, colleague, and just wonderful person to kick us off. Off to you, Rhoan.
Lance, you're so kind. Hi, everyone. My name is Rhoan Garnett. I want to start this conversation or this session with a question. And I'm going to ask you to sit with it, not just hear it. I want you to think of a moment, perhaps as a student, educator, or colleague, when you realized someone was experiencing the same room differently than you were. Maybe it was a student. Maybe it was you. Maybe it was a colleague whose hesitation you noticed before you understood why. They weren't unwelcome. The room wasn't hostile, but something unspoken already there before anyone arrived made the room feel different to them than it did to you. Maybe it was something you only understood in hindsight. I want you to hold that moment. That's where we're starting today. Not with AI, with that room. And with the question of what makes certain things difficult to see and what it takes sometimes to see them together. This conversation grows out of a series of conversations about belonging, institutional design, and what AI may be revealing about the environments we've already built. Earlier this spring, faculty across several American liberal arts institutions asked what AI had already walked into. In June, faculty at the American University in Cairo surfaced many of the same questions, but they also surfaced something else. The extent to which faculty themselves were navigating versions of the same conditions we often describe as student problems. So today, we are bringing those questions into a much larger room here. Not to look for the same answer everywhere, but to ask what the differences might teach us. In earlier conversations in this series, I named 5 belonging gaps, patterns in how belonging becomes difficult to sustain for students navigating institutions. The judgment gap, the shame gap, the map gap, the recognition gap, the legitimacy gap. Those names were chosen deliberately. They describe what the experience feels like from inside. We've since gone one layer deeper. Because naming an experience matters, but naming doesn't change it. To change it, we have to understand what produces it. Here's the frame. Belonging happens in relationships, but relationships don't exist in isolation. They are shaped by culture, history, language, policy, and by the ordinary routines of institutions themselves. Which means belonging isn't just a feeling. It's also an outcome of conditions that were already in motion long before any of us walked into the room. Some of those conditions were designed, some were inherited, arrived before any of us, already embedded in the architecture, the curriculum, the language of instruction. Some we continue producing without quite realizing it. No single builder, no single moment. That's the honest answer to who built the room. And it matters. It matters because we are the people currently in it. And the rooms we are comparing today weren't built by many different hands across many different histories. What holds across them, across us, may tell us something important about what is structural rather than local. What differs may tell us something equally important about what is produced by specific conditions rather than human nature. Here's the question I keep returning to. What does it mean when a chatbot feels lower risk than office hours? When a student reaches for AI before a professor or one of their peers, something is happening. I don't think the most interesting question is whether AI is good or bad. I think the more important question is what feels risky enough that some students would rather ask a machine first. The chatbot has no social memory. You can ask the same question 5 times and nothing follows you out of the conversation. It doesn't carry the weight of a room full of people watching you try and possibly fail. My colleague Lance once described making himself physically smaller in graduate seminars. Not because he didn't know the material, but because the social cost of revealing uncertainty in that room felt too high. That wasn't a failure of confidence. That was a rational response to a real signal. In June, a faculty member in Cairo named something she described as a big thing we really talk about. Students are using AI for therapy. Not as an experiment, not as substitute for support they cannot access. Because therapy costs money. Because stigma can make mental health difficult to talk about at home. Because, as she put it, finding a therapist can be so hard. The chatbot becomes available when human support does not feel available. AI may sometimes provide signals of belonging, recognition, or mattering. But what it is often filling are the design gaps in how we make help feel safe and in how we make human connection accessible. For students, that choice is an experience. For those of us who shape the conditions in which learning happens, it is data. It is telling us something about what we've built. But today's question is not only about what we've built. It is about whether we can see it together across the rooms we each inhabit. So, what are those conditions? Some of these conditions may name experiences you've been carrying for a long time. Some may only become recognizable as we talk together here. I want to name 5 of them briefly, not to teach them, but to give us shared language before we go deeper. Think of this as a compass before we start moving. Voice and difference. Whose way of speaking, writing, or thinking gets read as credible here? And whose gets read as needing correction? asking for help? Where does uncertainty feel safe enough to reveal, and where does it feel costly enough to carry alone? Navigating the systems. Who arrives already knowing the map, and who has to joy while walking? Belonging versus admission. Where does institutional welcome deepen after arrival, and where does it quietly fade? Whose knowledge counts? What kinds of knowledge feel recognized as is, and what kinds have to be translated before they're trusted? These are not simple things students carry alone. They are conditions designed, inherited, reproduced inside the institutions we each sit in right now. Students don't experience learning separately from belonging. And belonging is not stable if students do not also feel that their questions matter, their uncertainty matters, and their ways of making sense of the world matter. What feels possible to ask, to risk, to attempt, to not know, that is shaped by the conditions surrounding the learning itself. Which means belonging is not only a student services question, it is a teaching and learning question. And it is not only a student question. As we saw in the AUC session, it became clear faculty are navigating it too. Before we move into our conversation with you, Lance, I want to plan 2 questions. Lance, will you put these questions in the chat? The first is the same question from every conversation we've had in this series. If AI sometimes feel lower risk than office hours, what does it reveal about the environments we've built? If AI sometimes feels lower risk than office hours, what does that reveal about the environments we've built? Not the environments we intended, not the ones in mission statements or strategic plans, the ones students and you educators are actually navigating right now. And one more question, one that emerged from the faculty named in June. What would it take for what becomes visible in rooms like this one to survive after the room ends? What would it take for what becomes visible in rooms like this one to survive after the room ends? Hold both. We'll come back to them. That was the framing, sort of a diagnostic frame for the conversation. Now we're going to move into an exchange with Lance. Lance have moved across many institutions doing this work. And so he brings a really interesting perspective. So my first question to you, Lance, is a diagnostic frame. You've worked across many institutional contexts with AI in higher education. When you look at these 5 conditions, what feels most consistent across the rooms you've been in? And where have you seen the most variation?
Helps if I can find my mute button. So, I mean, I think for me, there's this rich continuum of students about their concerns and the possibilities about AI. Like we can see this full continuum. And what I think is also important that I see everywhere is like that full continuum often exists in individual students. We hear from them like resistance to wanting to use it or engage with it, and also defaulting to it when they run into different tensions. And so there's something about that, them sitting with that, and them sitting with that without real clear institutional guidance, consistent guidance. That I think when we talk about belonging in students in this space around AI, I do think one of the things I'm seeing as they're reaching for these tools, even when they don't necessarily want to, is an overwhelming sense of abandonment. That when we enter September, we're in academic year 5 of generative AI being available. May not feel like that, but that's where we are. And while it's not universally available in all contexts per se, um, it is very much around and available in different variations and forms. And what we haven't seen in that thing that I'm only maybe starting to see this year in institutions that I've been working with and interacting with is uh, institutional change, right? That students, oh, I love that somebody knew who the person was behind me. Mark, we have to have a conversation. Um, Mark is my new favorite person. Sorry for that distraction.
Good distraction, Lance.
Right? So like we have not seen significant institutional change. We've seen faculty really trying to figure this out, but we now have students have gone through both 2-year and 4-year entire higher ed education without clear and thoughtful curriculum engagement with these tools. And if students are lucky, they have encountered faculty who critically engage with AI and with them around AI. But they're just as likely to have faculty who haven't, faculty who ban it, sometimes faculty who are providing inaccurate information. I hear faculty use language at times about AI that was true 3 years ago, but may not be true today, right? And there's good reasons for those gaps. Like I do not want this to imply like the weights on the faculty, but I think what's happened in the larger picture is higher ed has ceded the narrative of AI and the ways to think about it and to talk about it and to interact with it to those tech bro trillionaires, right? Students are trying to find their way through this. And because there hasn't been significant curriculum change, it's been scattershot. Some institutions may not have policies or like are just starting the conversation. Like the narrative is dominated by what's out there already. And so again, they feel this pull to use these tools at times when they know it's not to their benefit. And I think that's really hard on students. That's something I see happening a lot. Um, and so I think that to me is like one of the big trends, one of the ways that's contributing in the space around like those conditions, what it means for students to grapple with this, that it's they're often doing it alone or they're doing it with a fraction of their faculty.
Lance, you work as you're on the other side now as a administrator. You've worked as a faculty. I noted in my framing that you had an experience as a student, particularly a grad student, right, where you felt like interacting with whatever text it was that you were interacting with, that you didn't feel like you could participate. And so I curious to bring that into view here in the context of those conditions. Like, can you describe for us what was happening there for you? This was long before AI, but I
Yeah.
asked that question because I think what's happening before AI is really relevant.
And I'll also articulate like I like my role is as staff at institutions and has been for 15 years, but I've been teaching part-time for 20 years. Which when we talk about belonging, one of the things we also miss out in this is the adjunct instructor. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
whole discourse there that many people have written on, but I want to elevate in this. And what I've also seen is like they're absent often from a lot of the support and the programming or the resources of an institution in helping faculty in this. So to my experience, it's one of the reasons I've often, when generative AI came out, have said like I would have loved a Michel Foucault bot
Mm-hmm.
because I think like I understand philosophy. Like I was studying American studies. Obviously, it was a subject that he's a key figure there in trying to read 20 pages of history of sexuality. just it broke me. Like I could not do it. And it wasn't through lack of trying. It wasn't like reading philosophy is incredibly hard for me. That 200-page book, I tried to read it for 15 years. I tried to visually read it for 15 years. The only way I got through that book after 15 years of like really trying, like every couple months, opening it up, trying to read a few pages, slow it, like not working, and like the only way I got through it is because the audiobook came out. In that for me, yeah, I hear you, Maha, right? Like the audiobook is the thing that like helped for me. But in that classroom, I just remember like I tried. It wasn't through a lack of trying, but showing up in that space and seeing people were like into it and ready. And you had there were Foucault fans in that class, and that was great. But like how do I even explain like I couldn't make it first through the first 3 pages. Like I remember like shrinking down, just trying to be like looking for that opportunity for like faux participation to be like, yeah, what that person said. Maha.
So you read Foucault and there was a community around you. I read Foucault and I was doing my PhD all alone, and
Oh,
I didn't know that I thought I was the only person who didn't get it.
oh God. No.
And that, because I was doing my PhD remotely, I didn't know anyone else who was reading Foucault at the time.
Mm,
And when I later discovered that everyone finds Foucault difficult, that would have helped me a lot. But
Right?
I feel I get you about the Foucault bot, but I just wanted other people that I could talk to. Like you
hmm.
went straight to the bot, but like, was it that people around you were making you feel like they understood it? Because yeah, if everyone around me did understand it, I would have felt bad. But
It, I think it largely got presented as everybody stepped in there with like a strong comfortability and familiarity with it. And like for my point with the Foucault bot, like I would have loved to initially just being able to like even test my understanding of it before stepping into a place with others, because the reality of the course was like we were going to cover Foucault that day, and then we're off to the races, because like every week, every class, we're reading a book in a chapter. We're not just read like that program. It was like a book a week and maybe a couple additional chapters and things like that. So I think for me it was one of those moments where I was just like, I need something. I love the chat going on. Yeah, we need a support group for Foucault, apparently. Love it.
Lance, in your previous uh, response, you talked about faculty navigating this AI space as well, right? And in the session at AUC, something came up that I didn't fully anticipate. Faculty were navigating versions of the same condition we usually describe as student problems. The
Mm.
cost of naming certain things, the risk of experimenting in ways that might not be sanctioned, the calculation about what is safe to say. Does that resonate with what you're seeing more broadly? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, it resonates a lot with me. It's like, and it's something I've been trying to name and emphasize since the beginning around AI. And in fact, this is part of an article that me and Maha and Anna Mills wrote, right? That like what faculty and students are facing are very similar challenges over the last 4 years. Um, and to me, it seems like an incredibly powerful opportunity to turn towards students and to work with students in figuring this out. And I think that hasn't happened enough. And it hasn't, like, again, it happens in some classes and in some spaces, but it hasn't happened enough of like recognizing this, thank you, Ma. This tool or this technology is really a stress, is really putting us all in like in a space of struggle. And there's a lot we can learn from one another. Right. That the gaps that you've identified, I think the other piece for me is like the gaps that you identified for students. I mean, I think there's we also have to understand they also exist for faculty as well.
So,
And
yeah.
as I mentioned already, like depending on their own educational experience, their own relationship with their institution, as I mentioned, adjuncts is a good example, but there's lots of layers throughout that, beyond that. Right? Each gap has this strong resonance with the way faculty are are in general in relationship with their institution, and then also with AI. But I want to keep the focus on students. In to your point that belonging is also about the system. I think that the challenge is this system it's a precarious system, and so we have a precarious experience for the students and what they're trying to do and what they're trying to achieve. But that level of precarity also exists among the faculty and among the staff. And so there is this sense among faculty and I guess staff as well of like, um, where is there even room to deal with AI? I think there's a honest felt sense of that that I think is important to name as well.
That brings me to this one. When the language of instruction is not the language students most feel fully themselves in, which is true across many of the contexts joining us today, what tends to shift in how these conditions operate? And I asked that question and take it back to you as, again, a graduate student in that class. You're a first generation student, right? And
Graduate student.
And
yep.
you hadn't interacted with this kind of literature before. So you're dealing with some sort of internal struggles and how you show up and participate in a classroom conversation. So I wonder what was the language of instruction at that time that might have been hindering you?
I mean, I think it boiled down to even not understanding the difference between an academic master's program and a professional master's program. Like that was one of the things in hindsight I had to learn and realize as somebody stepping into that space. And there's lots of other ways that we can see that and the undergrad level and whatnot. But I think for me, a lot of the classes, like a lot of those courses, and a lot of classes everywhere, they start off in the wrong space. I appreciate in the chat, I want to give a shout out to Ali, uh, Ali, my apologies. The deficit framing around students don't have basic skills. I think that like that irks me. That hurts me so much, like that framing. And to kind of the other side of this, it's either they don't have basic skills or the assumptions about who they are and where they are in their educational journeys is so assumed that you step into the class and you feel like you're already behind. And I think for me that tells me, or so much of my work probably in the last 10 years, even before AI, has been really trying to think about instead of starting courses in the discipline and expecting students to find their way to us, um, what does it mean to start with the students? And I know there's language of student-centered learning, but I don't know that I've yet found as much in that literature that feels in the ways that I've been thinking about this. Right? Because I think there's this mismatch. Uh, a lot of this mismatch is our language of instruction can be inherently deficit, right? That in so many of the rooms, that big concern about critical thinking and students don't have it and whatnot. These universal assumptions about our students, when students come into our class, like we see them through that lens as lacking. And it just blows my mind because if they've showed up to our classrooms, they have critical thinking. They have problem solving. They can do close reading analysis. They can do all of those things in specific contexts. And what our role is to help them recognize those skills that are already there or support the skills that they know are there and help introduce what do those skills look like when applied to our disciplines. I think too often we're starting in the discipline and not recognizing or registering they already have these things. I'll do, one of the activities I've been doing for years, and I love it because it's so reaffirming, is in my classrooms, and I'm often teaching literature or history or writing, places where, there's this expectation of like learning or applying close reading and analysis. And I will easily, I don't want to say easily, I through this activity get students to realize they have these abilities. And this is an activity that like I always have to like cut off at about 15 to 20 minutes because we could do the whole classroom doing this. I'll put 2 words up on the board or on the slide. And I will say, I want you to analyze this and tell me what it means. And I'll say, I just got this text from my friend. Here's what it says. It says just 2 words. It's fine. Students will have a field day analyzing the hell out of those 2 words, right? And so to me, that tells me they know how to do textual analysis. It's then my job to support them in how to do that in historical context or literary context. So to me, that is like, as we think about this, that language of instruction, navigating and being mindful of just the power and the frame that we put as we step into that role.
Lance, so that idea of I think you mentioned context, several times. It's always amazing to me when we're teaching concepts that I don't think we account for that enough. So I could almost imagine any young person I sort of interact with, and I ask them to a question about any sort of concept, and I situate it in the right context, a context that they understand where they're coming from. They oftentimes can articulate and give meaning to exactly what it is that I'm talking about. So, I think the reason I ask you that question too is for you to think back about like if you were presented with another text, if what you were learning would have made sense. Maha, I want to bring you in here. I'm curious. You co-founded Equity Unbound as a space for educators across contexts. I wonder what feels different about this conversation when it travels across institutions and national settings. What conditions seem to hold everywhere, and what seems specific to particular rooms? And
That's so interesting. Yeah, go on. You're gonna
no,
ask another question?
yeah, that's what I was just gonna say. That's a question is you've been doing this for a time now, and I'm just curious as we're having this conversations, and you're situated in AUC, but
Yeah.
you've had enough interactions across spaces, and I'm curious to know what you might be seeing across.
Yeah, yeah. So first of all of you who are here, the context of the American University in Cairo is different than other Egyptian universities. So it tends to be closer to a lot of European and American and maybe South African contexts. And South Africa and Egypt are different than the rest of Africa in general. We tend to be North Africa and South Africa. Actually, what I want to say is the conversation. I think people are more free when they're outside their institutions. So we can talk in a lot more depth and be a lot more honest about a lot of things and not be as afraid of being judged. I think even people from AUC, when they come to Equity Unbound, because obviously there's a lot of them here still, I think we still can talk a little bit more freely than when we're a room full of our own colleagues. But in terms of the structural issues that exist in universities that are leading students towards AI, I think they're quite similar everywhere, except for the non-native speaker thing. And it still exists in the US because you have a lot of students who are international students or who grew up in a home where English is not the first language, or even who have non-standard English. So that is also quite common across contexts. It becomes very different when you talk to people who are monolingual in some language other than English, and how they think about AI is actually from a completely different perspective. And what I think they don't realize is that AI behaves differently when you speak to it in a language that is like Arabic, that it's not very strong in. It's not that bad in it, but it doesn't have enough information in it. So it gives you colonialist information in your own language, which is very disturbing. I don't know if those of you who speak multiple languages have noticed that, especially if you speak even an even more minority language that maybe AI is even less trained on. And I worry about the sycophantic aspect related to what Lance was saying. If you create a Foucault bot and it's sycophantic, and I don't even know sycophantic, I don't even know if Foucault would be, but it will always tell you that your interpretation of Foucault is correct. But I think that would work for Foucault. It might not work for other philosophers. It's getting better, Hazem, the Arabic, but it sounds like a foreigner speaking Arabic, like the ideas, the mindset that is coming out is not an Arab person's mindset. Of course, I don't represent all Arabs, but generally speaking, I've lived in other Arab countries. It says weird things on the tongue of an Arab. It's very disturbing to me.
Yeah.
What were you laughing about, Lance? What are you thinking? And what's everybody else thinking also?
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say, Hazem, not to call on you, but I saw you shaking your head, and I was wondering what might have moved you.
It's just the fact that I understand where students like Matt was talking about people who don't speak English as a first language and how tempting it is and how it makes their life a lot easier. And I think this is particularly interesting because even people who can speak English, so if they speak English in second language, even if they speak English at C2 level with a very high proficiency, they are still tempted to use AI. They're still tempted to, and I think that it's available and everybody can use it. And I've always been thinking about like, is it something that we should celebrate, that how readily available AI is to everybody? I understand that we don't approach this with a blame mentality, but is it a structural problem? Is it something that we need to think about at an institutional level, that we should not have AI available to everybody at an arm's reach? They can just, is it something that we should advocate for, or is it something that we should embrace? But how do we do it also? I understand that I don't like it when people say the students do not know how to read, and I don't really like that deficit-based mentality. But it is having an effect. And I've tried, like in my classes, I've tried using AI with the students. I've tried having conversation about it with my students. I've tried to set limits. I've tried to agree with them on what to use and what not to use, when to use it and when not to use it. And sometimes it just feels that it's a shortcut that everybody's going to use. And it does have a detrimental effect on how people internalize information. And I myself, I was having this conversation the other day with a couple of other friends, and I consider myself, we consider ourselves really, really lucky that we had to do a lot of our master's thesis and all of our before AI came up because we had to put in the work. I'm not sure if it was there when I was doing my master's. I'm not sure if I was going to use it or not. It's just there and everybody can use it. And I don't want to sound pessimistic, but how do we stop it? Or do we need to stop it? Do we need to not make it available to students? I don't know. I don't have any answers.
And that's exactly why we're here. This is good. And that's a really good question to ask. If anyone care to sort of even add to that, I welcome you to come off your mic and speak to your own experience. Lance, I see you're eager.
Others. Ali, it looked like you almost came off mute. No? I was hallucinating?
Oh, just one point, like this is the great conversation. Just to what Hazem said, just somebody exactly said something similar last week. I was talking about my grad school trauma. I was saying like, oh, dude, like it took 9 years for me. If AI was available, I would be more productive in my writing because I as a first gen, I mean, just that like all the gaps, especially the shame gap, legitimacy gap, judgment gap. So if AI was there, because like my professor were not saying like they were nice. They were not saying like my writing is terrible. And I was like, I realized that when I defended my comps and just realized nobody understands what I'm writing. So if AI was available, maybe yeah, things might be harder to read, but also I feel it would be more clear for me to express my ideas in like a socially and academically accepted way. So I just wanted to share that. Thanks for giving me a chance to share that.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, that brings me to this. I mean, I'm curious, when important decisions are being made about teaching, learning, or AI, in your particular context, whose experiences are typically presented in that conversation and whose are absent? So I'm curious of this conversation we're having about AI. And so at an institutional level, when the conversation is being had, I'm just curious who might be in the room having the conversation of how this should look. I mean, you made a really good point, Ali, too. It's like I think it took me maybe 7.5, 8 years. And I've oftentimes felt like if I had AI, it would have helped me, reason with those things. But for me, in many cases, it would have been a partner, So my biggest concern is if you're using AI and you're not really engaging with the work itself, right? That's a major concern. So if you already know what you're doing and you understand these ideas that you're pursuing, and I think in that way it can be really useful. So as we have this conversation, about AI, I'm just curious for any of us here, institutionally speaking, like who's in those conversations around the governance of these tools?
Interesting. I'm hoping others will respond. I will be curious if there isn't, and that's itself its own interesting
That's
data
right.
point.
And I'll make this point that, and Lance, I'm curious for you because like I said, you moved to some of these many spaces here in the States, because this has been an interesting question. So in our last conversation, you made a comment that I thought was very, very important. You noted that it's been 5 years since AI has showed up in our institutions. And you said that you feel like institutions has abandoned students around this, right? So maybe this might be a good place to elaborate a bit more about what that looks like in what you're seeing across institutions.
Yeah. I want to distinguish. I think there's a sense of abandonment. I don't know that institutions have abandonment has been experienced. It may not have been intentionally acted upon, but impact, intent and impact, right? Those are
right.
not always together. I mean, I think it's again that idea of like we're 5 years in, there isn't a lot there hasn't been a lot that has happened. And the thing that I keep now thinking about is it'll be academic year 5 of generative AI, but also academic year 2 of agentic AI. And I don't think we're even ready for like those conversations and trying to figure out where, if anywhere, is there value added around agentic AI in teaching and learning. I do think at this point I think we know there's always like, we know there's concerns about generative AI and never not say otherwise. But I think we also are finding places where it can be helpful in the service of teaching and learning, whether that's simulations practice or having students, use it in certain ways to um, get certain feedback at certain stages. Like there's some interesting use cases that have evolved. I don't think we're anywhere close to that with agentic AI, right? That it's largely framed as an efficiency tool in this space where what we're trying to hold on to is intentional, deliberate friction. And so that, for me, that's why I'm using that language of abandonment, why I'm feeling that strong angst in this moment is to really notice, like, you've got your Claude Cowork and Code and ChatGPT Codex, and these are things that are really interesting tools. Yes, sorry, thank you for asking, Hazim. So in the last 2 years, you've had a range of these tools, these AI tools that are one step above generative AI. If we think about generative AI, it's largely creating content, audio, video, code, text. Agentic AI is AI that can actually take actions on your computer on your behalf. And different people have different feelings about to the degree they want to let that happen. But for instance, I can now use something like Claude Cowork and say, hey, go to my downloads folder and organize all of that. Go into this folder and rename all of these PDFs that I have downloaded, all of these articles, and rename them according to what the article is in the metadata, and then group them into relevant subfolders and create a spreadsheet that like maps all of that, right? So agentic AI allows for a bit more active action on the behalf of the AI. You might have heard of it briefly in February when Einstein AI was released, where it was the service being pitched to students that for $40 a month, this AI tool will go in and basically take their course, like complete their online course. It was shut down, but it's a perfect like it was shut down fairly quickly, but it's a perfect proof of concept of what agentic AI can do.
Yeah. There's some richness in the chat, which is not surprising. Lance, we created a slide with some questions to bring people into the conversation, come off their screens. We also have the Padlet. Can we share the link? And I don't say that for you guys to interact with it right now, but I just want to give it in case that after this conversation, you have a space to go to and, if you're sitting with things right now or something comes up after the fact. But I also want to share these questions in the chat because I really want to encourage conversations. And these are just questions that, Lance and I came up with to guide the conversation. But I'm just curious, if there's anything that's moving any of you right now that you sort of want to speak to. What I just shared in the chat is just guidance if it's helpful. And I think we're getting to some of this, right? I mean, like that second question, where does AI show up as the easier option for your students or colleagues? And what does that tell you about what the harder option is asking them to risk? Lance, I don't remember if you said this, but what was the reason for shutting down the Einstein
lawsuits? They were getting a cease and desist order, I think, from one of the LMSs, and they, of course, they presented as we just wanted to show you that this is what is happening. Yeah. I think there's a couple good explanations of it, probably like Inside Higher Ed, if you just do Inside Higher Ed and Einstein AI. The thing I want to circle back as people are starting to gather their thoughts about the question is like this question about where it shows up, and I believe it was Azim brought it up first, how much it might impact what we're doing in our learning. I do think, and I feel like there's precedence for this, that it often has resulted in moving the goalposts in terms of what becomes expected. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's problematic. But the example that I think about is, and this comes from like my dissertation and the work I did, which was on like academic piracy and how scholars access research literature. And one thing I found was, first off, the expectations in growth of citations has changed as we moved into the digital space. So now there is and this is where it's both problematic, but also it creates a bigger sense of the work that there's an expectation more so. And again, this may be different in different contexts. There's a larger expectation of you are going to find nearly all the works that existed. And you see that in the amount of citations in dissertations, research papers, et cetera. There's a higher expectation about there's just a higher expectation of what you're going to access and integrate into your work. There's higher expectations about the quality of the work or what stage it's in. So I do wonder about, what does this impact? What might this impact look like? Does it mean that there's different things now that come to be assumed? A level of data analysis that might not have been presumed. Does it, like, it may turn into like now, I'm not saying whether this is good or bad, but this is where my mind goes of now does the expectation that, all research should be quantitative and qualitative to the degree that it can. Like, are there new things that emerge that create higher expectations if some of the tools make certain parts of this easier? Not a answer, or I posit that out as a possibility.
I have a funny story about an undergrad student. Oh, sorry, John. I'll just say this really quickly. Who was using Perplexity to find something. And usually, when I teach about research tools, I say compare what the research tool gives you to what Google Scholar gives you to see if it's giving you good quality sources. But the student was like, here's a paper that Perplexity gave me that no other Google or Google Scholar search gave me, which to me is an indication it's not a good quality paper. But he said, but it was so useful. Because it was just exactly what he wanted, because Gen AI gives you exactly what you want rather than just the keywords kind of thing. And so it probably wasn't a good paper, but it was exactly what he was looking for, and that made him happy. But my problem with that is there is value in not finding exactly what you want and having to read more than what you thought you wanted so that you can learn deeper and more.
Yep.
But then it's difficult for someone to realize this unless they've experienced it, Go ahead, John, and then I'd love to hear from a woman other than myself.
That's fair.
I'll defer if someone of the female persuasion wants to say something.
John, we have some time, and you can speak in until someone comes up.
I'll change my pronouns for the next 5 minutes. So I think that Lance asked a really interesting question, right? Like how does the bar change now that we have more tools? And I think there's sort of like a good and bad side. Like the good side to me is even in just teaching, not even just publication, I realized that, I was teaching this class in web design essentially, and I wanted to show students like there's a lot of rookie mistakes they make, like, centralized layouts and like Times New Roman font, and just sort of like, this looks really amateurish and it comes up every year, but I can't just give them bullet points. They won't pay attention. I want to show examples of before and after and what the code would be to change that. So I realized I could very quickly create a sort of gamified interface that would show them the original website, ask them to change some bits, and then show what the website looks like afterward. And in the end, have this quiz, and they'd sort of like, basically experience the lesson instead of having me lecture on it. And, it took me like a couple of days, and I had this perfect thing that they thought was fun, and I didn't have to teach. So that raises the bar for me in terms of like, I'm now able to give them more interactive experiences that are customized to whatever that lesson has to be. I may not even use it next year, but I knew that this would be valuable for them in this context. That's the good side. It kind of raises the bar for what we can do as teachers, and as a researcher, you could produce a level of analysis using similar tools that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do if you never learned R or whatever other programming language. Right. But on the downside, in addition to enabling lots of new good research to get published, we're enabling lots of crap to be published. And that was the focus of my MYFest presentation on enslopification. And I gave some examples of how that that could actually be the content you get, like Maha's example of the student who found just the article that supported her or his perspective, that can be created even by a news source. So like, in the worst case scenario, you and I go to the New York Times, but my version of that story is different than your version of that story because it knows what I want to see. And I, again, in my MYFest session, gave examples of that and how that might work. But it's not just me. Joanna Stern, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, just posted a YouTube video about looking up her books on Apple's iBook platform and finding out there were dozens of copies of them. And ironically, her book is called I'm Not a Robot, but in fact, she is a robot, or at least her book has been duplicated dozens of times. And it's very hard for students to know the difference.
It's very hard for everybody to know the difference.
Yeah, in the chat, Sukina wrote, how much friction is good friction for learning and struggle in learning, and how much friction do AI tools take away, and how do we or the students make the decision?
Yeah. I wonder if Sakina wants to, do you mind coming off your mic and saying more about that? I mean, because that's really, that can bring us back to that question of if AI sometimes feel lower risk than office hours, what does that reveal about the environments we've built? So that question of friction, I'm curious.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as a lot of us have been speaking about, cognitive friction and cognitive offloading and how much is enough, and it's clearly contextual, and sometimes we don't know actually. But I was also thinking in the context of this conversation about social friction, that we put our students through quite a lot to get help, perhaps. And so certainly in some of the focus groups I've done a little while ago now around students' use of AI and for assessment support, there was quite a few, there's some data to suggest that, yes, it's just easier to consult a large language model for the answer, but also the writing center is not available 24/7. It's hard to, there's certain conditions that they have to go through for them to make them eligible to do X. So I think there's this kind of I was just thinking, there are social frictions for students, and so perhaps that's one of the different ways of thinking about it, as well as the learning aspect, cognitive friction, which we assume is a good thing because some discomfort, having to read something fully, having to make notes, actively learning helps, and so on. So I think that's just where I was going with that comment. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I think we are talking about the academic context, but that social piece of it, I think, the social piece of it to learning becomes really, really important. So appreciate that. Shanali?
Hi there, everyone. Please excuse the lack of camera.
It's okay.
So I wanted to pick up on the two ideas of friction in light of a particular group of students. So I don't teach undergrads, I teach postgrad students, and almost all of my postgrad students are professionals. So they might be academics, they might be learning designers, graphic designers, video editors, curriculum advisors, that kind of category of human. And in some of the conversations we've had about the kind of, let's call it cognitive friction, right? The term I've been hearing this evening. For many of my students, they know they need to engage with the cognitive friction. They want to engage with the cognitive friction. But in the rest of their lives, they have all the other things that lecturers, teachers, academics, learning designers have to do. And so under pressure, they turn away from the learning they want to do and need to do and choose the version of the learning that they engage with the LLM that they feel unsatisfied by, but that they know will let them pass the course with a minimal grade, or with like a scrapey kind of grade, and it will be fine, and they will have kind of achieved their instrumental outcome, but actually secretly been a little bit unhappy with the developmental outcome they set for themselves. So that's the one challenge I'm thinking about with my students, is how do we create conditions so that they can honor the developmental outcomes that they're really interested in for themselves, and not just the instrumental outcomes. If I have the course credit, it looks good on my CV, it's nice for ad hom, etc., etc. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that in many of the spaces in which I engage with students, one of the things that people express discomfort around is social friction. So having to engage with somebody who speaks English in a different way from you, having to engage with somebody who has different cultural values from yours. And so I wonder a little bit about whether, particularly in highly diverse environments where people are encountering difference in ways that are actually socially generative, whether allowing our students or creating conditions where our students can easily turn to an LLM as a proxy for human interaction, we rob them of the opportunity to engage with real humans who they disagree with, who they have to engage with once they step outside the classroom. So I'm interested a little bit in how we maintain conditions for both cognitive friction and social friction within the safe container of the classroom space, or safe-ish container of the classroom space. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for taking the question.
I'd like to tackle that. Cited a discussion that a number of us had on this topic, but I want to talk to one specific piece, which is this use of the term friction. Friction is something that gets in the way of a task. That's the physical definition. It is not work or achievement. It is actually wasted effort. And I think students, when we valorize that term, we have good reason to do it, because the AI, tech bros will all be like, oh, we'll have a frictionless society where money flows all around, and we know how well that goes. But on the other hand, I think that you as a teacher have the ability to switch the goal of the lesson to clarify that something that they might see as friction is actually valuable and not friction. In other words, I can say, oh, you have to do a group project. The fact that the other person comes from a different cultural background or believes something different or speaks a different, native language is an impediment to you achieving that project. Or I can frame it that this is what you're learning. Like, this is not friction. This is the task that we are working on. It is not friction on the way to another task. I don't know how well that will translate to every circumstance, but for me, I think this is the great value of having a live, in-person class, or at least a class between humans in the world of AI. No chatbot is going to, or it is harder for chatbots to train you for that very important lesson you'll have to apply outside of school, which is getting along with people that you disagree with or come from different backgrounds.
I want to call out Mark, because I think Mark was ready to also.
Thanks. Yeah, I turned my camera on. So I've been talking with a machine about friction. First of all, I'm not an academic. I spent 40 years as a craftsman, 20 of those in Santa Clara, California. Don't call it Silicon Valley. But here I am, trespassing once again.
You're welcome.
But I do work as an academic designer and staff for a small graduate institute. So it's confusing. Anyway, thanks, Maha. So first I have to say I'm always amused, I guess is the right word, by the language of academia, which is constantly borrowing from the real world, which is not academia. So there's that. So friction, yeah, it's a physics term. And I had a nice chat with the machine about friction on a frozen lake or a frozen road. if you're trying to go up a frozen road, you definitely want some friction, or else nothing, or the same thing on a piece of ice. If you have no friction, then you're stuck. So that was a fun chat. But what I've been doing recently is, and I put in the chat, there's desirable friction as a learning term. So that's the cognitive friction. And somewhere I couldn't find the reference, but it's the note-taking people that merged the biology term eustress, good stress, which is the kind of stress that makes plants grow, like pruning is eustress. And then I've been talking with the machine and came up with malstress. And that's that social stress we've been talking about. That's the bad stress. That's the writing center closed at 5 o'clock, but I have a job. That's bad stress in your academic setting. But then because I'm so anti-binary thinking, I'm a Trinitarian. I always go for the third position too. And so what the machine came up with distress. And that's the institutional stress. And that's what I'm most familiar with as a person who returned to college in their late 50s. There was a lot of stress being treated like an 18-year-old on all levels. And so that's how I'm theorizing it as three kinds of stress: good stress, bad stress, and then distress. And I returned to college in Oakland, California, a very difficult situation. I did it deliberately because of the multiculturalism. But I watch students wash out, drop out, and in some cases get killed while trying to get an education at a local community college, which is rebranding itself as a city college these days. So yeah, there are many kinds of stress, and I think that's a great conversation. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Mark, you talk about institutional friction. Am I getting that correct?
Yeah.
And you said that's dear to you. Like, do you have any examples of what you were experiencing?
Sure. It took me 2 years to get my pre-approved federal financial aid. And that was common. And so being an old white guy in multicultural Oakland, which was also an interesting challenge, I banded together with my brother students and we formed the first 4 college-wide student council. And after a 2-year campaign, we got the student financial aid services to install the Oracle software that they'd had sitting on a shelf and were paying $1 million a year in license fees and not using, for instance.
Yeah.
Now 95% of the students get their financial aid at the beginning of the first semester. And that was about 20% when I showed up.
And what's the connection between that challenge, that financial aid challenge, and the multicultural environment?
In that case, it wasn't so much the multicultural environment, it was just the institution itself. Although the departments were sorted by identity, which is a very fascinating way to structure an organization.
Oh, that's weird. I was thinking that a lot of the kinds of barriers, I mean, what you're calling stress, institutional stress, are just like barriers that are there and
Yeah.
related to the question on the Padlet of the kinds of things that are there that are sort of preventing students from getting the help they need because they don't understand the way the system works. One of the things that upsets me a lot is when professors think rigor is letting students go through hoops to find something. The main thing is not all students go through the same hoops. And so it's not an equitable thing.
Right.
Some people understand how higher education works, or they understand how the system works, or they understand how this professor thinks, and they figure it out and it's smooth, and then they can get to the actual learning. For the others, it's a barrier to even get towards the learning. So then going back to all these different types of stress or difficulties, is this difficulty part of the learning journey so it's going to help me learn? Then I don't want to lose that difficulty to AI, because then like reading research articles too fast means you haven't actually read them in depth, and finishing your PhD too fast means you haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it in one way. But another way, you can't finish your PhD because your supervisor is being an asshole and not responding except like 3 months later. Sorry, that was kind of what mine did to me. This is being recorded. It's being recorded, isn't it?
Yes, it's being recorded.
He did that sometimes. So anyway, that's a different kind of stress, right? Like necessary, or in other words, like the Australians talk about extraneous load in terms of cognitive offloading, talk about extraneous load and intrinsic load. So something is intrinsic to the thing, therefore we need to do it, because if you shortcut it, you've actually lost something. But if it's extraneous, we do want to get rid of it so that we don't waste time on it.
Yeah, that's what I'm
But I
calling
think
the malfriction, the bad.
yeah, and I think students may have a different perspective on this than us. And that's the disconnect with AI, is that they think the reading we're giving them is extraneous. That's why they're using AI to read. And I'm thinking, well, we should be assigning more interesting readings that are at their reading level. If a professor assigns students readings that are way above their reading level and long ones, and assumes that non-native speakers are going to be able to do this for 5 courses, to read readings that are about a new topic that they don't understand in academic language that they can't interpret, and so many pages that they don't have time for, and they'd rather be doing something else that is more motivating for them, like playing video games or whatever else. I understand why they would do that
And
if I'm not doing my part.
yeah, and I wanna add, because I think that idea that like that the good stress, as it were, and where that shows up. So first off, like I endorse the like better effective learning materials, but I think that sometimes the challenge, like the assumptions that we have about what all of those skills are that they should be developing and how they sometimes fit together. I continue to think about a student I had back in spring of 2023 who came in. It was a course on AI in education, and she came in and she was grappling with this question because we were trying to build the policy for the AI policy for faculty and students at the institution I was at. And she was grappling with, she's like, I don't know what to do with this. And she came to explain that she had taken her notes, and put them into AI to reorganize them, not change anything, but just to put them in some kind of order. And she was like, do I cite this? Do I not cite this? And like, we're talking about what is documentation and all of that stuff means. But as I learned more about the context, like for her, like the organizing of notes was for her the artificial barrier to actually doing the work. And I say that because like I know note taking can be important, but was a person who was in her 30s. Like she knew she was not like a organize your notes kind of person. And she was in the thing about organizing the notes was it kept her from doing the thing she was going to be evaluated on the paper, and being very comfortable writing the paper, being very comfortable like owning the work. And so there's this interesting thing that for me I think about is there's some of these things, it becomes very individualized in a way that it makes us have to think about what are the exact things we're asking or expecting of them in those skills, and where on that individual level is there some um, do we recognize that it may not, some things don't, like we don't all think and work in the same ways. Shanali, like basically you just kind of have them like typed, either typed, handwritten, like just not in a real like how do these different themes go together if I'm going to write a paper or things like that. They're just kind of scattershot. They might on a page be like they might be on a page like 2 columns and not necessarily related and stuff. So it was like they were just her trying to get things down on paper or in digital format. That's the best way I could describe it. So that to me there was something really interesting in recognizing like even some of the pathways we take for our learning can be different. And so as we think about what it means to structure learning opportunities, in where AI prove might remove a stress might remove a bad stress, even if we think it's a good stress. I don't think there's a good, clear answer there. It's just, it sticks in my head in this conversation.
One of my things that I struggle with, especially at my graduate institute, is, and I did as a returning student at middle-aged, is the whole onboarding process. People, they have this deficit framing, the students don't have this skill or don't have that skill or whatever, but there's no comprehensive evaluation of incoming students. And I think AI actually can help that way, in that I'm trying to build a course, an automated course that's first used as assessment, turned as a tool for assessment, and then finds the gaps that the student has, and then offers the training necessary to upskill in that area. Trying to do it in my institution is very small and has no money, so I'm trying to figure out a way to do it. And then again, I'm big on open, so once it works, I'll just release it and people can adapt it themselves. But this goes back to going back to college. I met with counselors, and I'm in California, and so I know we have a different, every locale has a different approach. But my experience with counselors, as someone who came in with a bunch of credits, because I always took night classes, their approach was, what's the quickest way to get you out of here? And that was their focus. It's like, well, what 9 courses can I put you in to get you out of here? And I didn't find that helpful particularly. And then you go to the writing center, and like most of the institution, it's focused on words. Well, I came in as a craftsman, and a performer. And so I'm perfectly capable of communicating, but I wasn't a very good writer. Well, and my writing was okay, but I'm just very slow. But the support was just poor across the board. And then when you talk about computing, they had a Microsoft Word package that they offered students. This was just 10 years ago. So what I'm getting towards is we need some serious assessment and onboarding that's not these general tests, SAT, which comes and goes out of American education. Not that kind of, but some actual assessment of the human, the person, and then the support. And so I just use the word onboarding. And I find it true with faculty too. I work mostly with faculty now. And the faculty are terrified of AI, and they don't use it, they don't understand it, and then they want to we're currently trying to make a policy. And so people who really have never used AI are trying to create an AI policy, which I find problematic. I'll stop.
No, good points. Nora, we need to disconnect from AI even in the classroom. What's happening there for you? What are you observing?
I feel that sometimes students are silent in class. They sneak out their phones. I bet they're chatting with the bots. I wish they'd raise their hand and ask me or ask their peers any questions, comments during peer work. But they're addicted to their phones. That's a big issue. They're addicted to AI. They're addicted to their phones. I thought of taking their phones away from them once, but I think where I work, I teach at AUC. I don't think I can do that, right? Maha,
I'm just gonna say you can. I give a
can,
workshop and
okay.
there are people who can, and the students eventually appreciate it if you're doing an engaging class.
Okay,
Sorry,
okay, well
there were
that's
lots of
good.
hands up, but I'm just saying you can tell
Maha,
them,
thank
please
you
put your
so
phone
much
away.
thank you so much for telling me this. Okay, yeah. So yeah, I think disconnecting from AI, having more them do more group work, just being engaged in conversations. I'm thinking also of maybe having them go to the library, like scheduling a trip to the library as part of the course to. I bet most of them haven't even been to the library, so maybe just,
This is really interesting.
take them around, just get them motivated, encourage them. does anyone have the same concerns that students they just want to get all the information from AI instead of books, instead of articles?
Yeah. Hassan, go ahead. I think it'd be interesting to have librarians and see how that space has changed. That's a really good point, Noah. Hassan?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the very positive framing about like positive stress and useful friction. For me, it's always been necessary pain, and I'm sorry for my negative framing of this. Like the things that stuck with me, the thing that I was able to internalize and recall later on are the things where when I finished reading them, my head just hurt a little bit or a lot. And there has to be, it's like going to the gym. If you go to the gym and you keep pulling the same weights, and then later on, your body's not hurting anymore. But my question is, you did talk a lot, guys, about like support and giving people enough support and giving students enough support. And I also want to touch on what Maha said about how students actually think, and then also Nora also touched on this because they seem to think about this whole AI situation in a very different way. And like Nora was saying, because I remember I had this conversation once with students when we were having discussions about AI and about necessary friction, or this a little bit of pain that your head just needs to hurt a little bit for you to learn something. And then they said, okay, we understand this, but again, we're using AI anyway because it's easier. So my question is the one that I've been grappling with for ever since AI has become this reality is how do we get students to actually understand this reality? How do we get them to be aligned with our thinking about necessary friction and positive stress? How do I convince somebody that, hey, yes, you have this tool that can do pretty much of or 85%, 90% of the work that you need to be doing. And how do I convince that person? Because I can go to somebody right now that say that they're going to have like an elite level competition, and if I tell that person, or that, hey, I'm just gonna give you this pill, and then it is just going to make you as strong as you want it to be without any of the hard work, and it's not gonna have any negative repercussions on your health. 9 people out of 10 will take that pill. And so what my question is, how do we actually get students to, how do I get those athletes to actually do in the work, to put in the hours in the gym? How do I get students to accept that level of, I don't know, desirable friction, some pain in your head after you read something? How do I get them to accept that reality? And, so that's the question. And thank you so much, everybody, for listening to my ranting about my frustration.
I don't think you're ranting at all. I think that's what Noah is, getting at. I think that's a lot of what I think this conversation is about. So much of the conversation is about AI and about these tools, but something has been happening long before these tools show up. So even when I hear Noah talk about students are on their phone, I don't even think of AI first. I think of like social media. I think of like all of the ways that students get distracted, and perhaps how do we curb some of that? Like how do we get students back present? But Heather, you had your hand up, so I want you to chime in.
Yes, I can do that. So I teach English in Germany, so it's a non-native language for all of my students, and I generally can get them to talk with one another, like in pairs or in small groups, and they are generally pretty engaged with each other instead of being on their phones and whatnot, unless they're looking up a word or something. And then I found that when I asked them, in closing the conversation, to ask for voices, for students to talk to the whole class, to share their ideas or their partner's ideas with the whole class, oftentimes what will happen is nothing will come, or maybe the same, more extroverted students will contribute to that full class conversation. And so what I found is a nice way to bring in more voices is to actually give them a little survey form, for example, a Google form, and ask them, one simple question there, and then you can have more, students contribute there. They're not, getting it from generative AI or from somewhere else. They're typing in their answers, and then I can bring in some of those other voices. So I found that to be helpful in my classes, but that won't necessarily work for everybody.
Do you then later ask them to expand on what they wrote?
It will depend on the purpose of the activity, on what I want to do next in the class, or what I want to, how I want
Because
to.
I noticed that some people who don't speak don't even value their ideas, so they don't realize their ideas are worth sharing. And then so when they've written it, maybe the day before or the same day, and then you call on them to expand, that validation that what they say has value, then makes them later more willing to speak up in class, even without that writing exercise. But definitely the writing, I think, especially for non-native speakers, right? Because the nervousness of just speaking in the other languages is in itself a problem.
Yeah, and it can also be dependent on the culture. For example, my German students, this is their country, their culture, so they tend to, contribute more, whereas my students from China are more quiet, in the full conversations, full group, full class conversations. And to circle back to the stress points, there is actually one more, in my opinion, facet of that, and that is boredom. When there's not any stress at all. So you've got, boredom, then you've got eustress. This is like the perfect amount of stress or pressure. And then I liked the idea of malstress and then distress.
Mark, look what you did.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to seed the conversation.
That's right.
And I like that. Before we go, I don't know, is this a 90 or 2 hour? I don't remember. The question I keep asking, and I'm not the most popular person in my institution, I can say that. The question I keep asking is, why isn't the institution, why aren't the people at the top? Because we keep talking about the students and the deficit framing and all that, which is fine. I mean, that's the majority of the institution. There's no doubt about that. But my question is, why aren't the people running the institution asking, how does this institution have to change? How, again, as a visual person and a performer, and I have to toot my own horn, the third person to get the Canadian Certificate in Digital Humanities, as a person who works more visually than with words, when will the institution adapt to the different types of people that come in, whether they're culturally different, cognitively different, age differences, all of the student body has definitely expanded. But when will the institution say, oh, look, there's this word generating machine, and we're an institution built out of words. This might be a problem. This might be existential. And to me, there seems to be ways around it, but I cannot get the conversation started. And I'm in a bunch of these groups. I mean, some of you I run into here and there in different AI groups and education groups. But that's the conversation nobody wants to have is does the institution have to adapt? I mean, dramatically change. And our friend Brian Alexander has been tracking how institutions are closing one a week for a decade, and just in the United States, for over 500 are just gone. And that's not changing, that's accelerating. And so to me, there's an existential crisis. I'm old, so, not really going to hurt my life. But for the future, it seems like that's a discussion that needs to be had.
Heather, where are we?
We are at time. Do you two want to wrap up?
Lance, last words.
I think this is, I hope this has been a useful discussion. I know we're struggling with that. Like, what do we do in the classroom? And how do we navigate some of these reactions? I do think it comes back to, again, really thinking about what does it mean to start with where the students are and start to look for those opportunities. Because I don't think, like, in the world that we're in, the different pulls at them, what's going to drive them most is, it may sound, the things that they're excited about are the things that are going to drive what motivation we can lean on. And so I would encourage to continue to think about what that can look like. Back to you.
It's been rich. That's it. That's a great way to end this conversation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
I think,
everyone.
yeah, Mark, I think you make it a point. I think one of the questions I asked about was who's making decisions about teaching, learning AI, and it was interesting early on that when I asked that question, no one responded, and so I think here we are. That's a question that you're bringing up about what's happening in these spaces and how are we going to have a conversation about what this really looks like. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. So this was great. Thank you guys for having me here. Maha, as always, you're amazing.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you too. This was amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. It was really nice.